Hello and welcome to my channel. Here's another drawing of the great white shark. This one is also going to be done in a combination of colored pencil and pastel. I've already done a drawing of a shark in a similar technique. This one is going to be a little bit different in terms of the composition because it's mostly going to be focusing on the head and the jaws. And slightly different colors too, but similar materials because I'm going to be working on a UART 800 sanded paper, about 9 times 12 inches in size. I'm going to use colored pencils, Faber-Castell Polychromos, and I'm going to use some pastels. I'll get to that later. Anyway, I see a lot of these gray tones, light gray tones, mid gray tones in the reference. The reference is going to be in the description, by the way, as usual. So it's a good thing that I have lots of grays in my Faber-Castell range. That's another reason why I decided to use a combination of colored pencil and pastel. Even though, I mean, a drawing like this you don't have to use mixed media at all, but I just thought that it would be fun. Because some of the details on the shark, maybe they're a little bit better to do with colored pencils, and the background is more or less plain bluish background. It's easier to do with pastel, so I decided to use a combination of the two. Anyways, you can see I'm drawing some of the smaller, darker details with a black colored pencil. Some of these larger areas with a gray pencil, because those are mostly the colors that dominate, and there are also some greenish tones here at the top. So I'm going to be using a combination of black, gray and green for that top darker part of the shark. Because when you look at the reference photos of the great white, you will see that it's usually two colors that dominate. It's mostly a light gray color overall, or that's the way it looks to me. But it looks more like a light gray or white at the bottom, and at the top of the body it's a slightly darker color, like a darker gray. So that's what I'm going to be going for, except for the fact that because of the environment there's going to be some other colors like bluish and greenish tones because the scene takes place in the sea. Now as for the teeth, they're kind of complex because they grow in rows where the new teeth grow and replace the older ones. And I'm not really going to try to capture every single detail there. I'm just going to try to capture some of the larger, more general shapes, and here, as you can see, I have to work around them with a black pencil so that these lighter shapes would stand out. And one of the challenges that I always have with UART 800 is that because it's a lighter colored paper, if I want to overcome the background color of the paper with darker colors, I have to try to fill in that tooth thoroughly, and sometimes also even use more pressure if necessary. But one of the best, or probably the best method, and my favorite method of blending on this surface, is simply to use lighter colors on top of the darker ones. That muddies them a little bit and allows me to blend more smoothly. And if I end up with a color that is too light or lighter than I initially intended it to be, I simply go over it again with a darker pencil. And if I feel like there's a little bit too much texture again, then I go back in with a lighter pencil. So I can sometimes go back and forth between a lighter and darker pencil when I'm trying to both get the color that I want and to blend it properly so that I don't have an ugly texture or anything. I'm starting to work around the outer edge of the shark's body, with a blue pencil because the background is mostly going to be blue, but I decided to do a little bit of work with a colored pencil first because I needed a bit more precision as I was working around those smaller shapes like teeth. And then after that I switched to a pastel pencil. Here for the most part I'm going to use the Master's Touch woodless pastel pencils. These kind of look like sticks, but they're not really sticks, they're just woodless pencils. And the reason why I'm using these is because I have a pretty nice range of colors in these. I started with this blue, which I wasn't entirely happy with, so I decided to go for a slightly lighter and warmer blue with a bit of a greenish component in there. I thought that it would go better with some of these greenish tones on the shark's body, those grey greenish tones. And as you can see, I did the top part of the background, and I'm going to be doing a little bit of work on the main subject and then a little bit of work on the background. I have to do both at once because it's easier for me that way, because I could just do the main subject first and then work around it using the background color of my choice, but because there are some lighter parts of the shark's body, in order to establish that contrast with the background and in order to know how much value I need, especially in those lighter areas, it's a little bit easier for me to put down a little bit of that background color first. So I establish that contrast between the background and the main subject, and that way it's easier for me to understand how much value I need in other parts of the shark's body. It's called value interaction because sometimes the amount of value you pick or the color you pick can appear just right, but when you put it next to something darker it appears too light or too flat. So I decided to start putting in a little bit of that background color at a time in order to be able to gauge how much value I need on the main subject. Now for the shark, you can see that there are a lot of these grayish tones, and what I'm trying to do most of the time is I'm trying to blend using lighter grays on top of the darker tones. There are some bluish tones here at the bottom, so the bottom side of the shark's body is going to be a bit more of a kind of a bluish gray color, cooler gray and bluish color, and almost blending into the background in some places. So here I'm going back in, working around those teeth, cleaning up some of the edges and adding some of those lighter shapes so that the teeth would stand out better against the background. Also, another thing that I'm adding is some of the light effects on some parts of the shark's body, which is catching light from above, and also because the ripples in the water are creating some light effects on the shark's body. I'm gonna imitate those by putting some lighter streaks of color on top of these darker colors. But in order to proceed with that, first I need to draw some of the darker shapes first. Here I'm drawing some of these openings for the gills, and they also have a little bit of shadow here to the right so that they would appear more three-dimensional, but I have to soften that shadow area a little bit with a bit of gray and maybe some greenish tones, so I can't leave them looking like just a bunch of lines, because that way they wouldn't look very three-dimensional. So I need to explain to the viewer what's casting a shadow onto what, and what is raised, the raised part of the surface, and which is the darker and the lighter part of that surface. At the top here, as you can see, I'm using a darker color, a little bit of black and a little bit of darker green, and then a bit of mid-tone gray, middle gray, to soften that and to blend it a bit by removing some of that texture that simply is a result of working on this paper. The finest paper that UART has is 800 grit. For colored pencils, it would be even better if they had something like 1000 grit, but they don't, which is why I think that UART is probably a lot more suitable for pastels than it is for colored pencils. But as you can see, I've done a number of drawings in colored pencil as well, or using a combination of both, so it can work if you know what you're doing, and I hope that I know what I'm doing. What I'm using here is a light earth green. It's kind of like a really dull greenish color, and it goes well with the tones that I already laid down, because I want a dull grayish color here at the top, and it still needs to be a little bit darker because, as I've already explained, the top part of the shark's body is a bit darker, and in order to create some kind of value contrast between the upper part and the lower part of the body, I need to use darker colors at the top, but at the same time, if I go too dark, I get a lot of texture, and I need to soften that a little bit, and that light dull greenish color is working perfectly for me now, because it's very similar to gray with just a touch of green. You can also see that around the edge of that darker area there are some irregular shapes, almost like speckles. I'm trying to capture that as well as these lighter shapes. These are light effects that are a result from the light breaking through the water, through the ripples in the water, and it's creating these irregular looking shapes or streaks of light on the shark's body. In some places it's a little bit lighter than in others, so I'm using a combination of light grey and maybe a touch of white to try to represent that. The greys that I used here are warm greys, so I only used warm greys in a combination with some greens and some black. And for the background, as you can see, I'm using something like, how should I describe it? I don't really know the exact name in the Master Touch range, but it's kind of like a mid-tone bluish color that has a little bit of a greenish component in it. Something in between bluish and greenish color. So as you can see, I'm softening that texture on this upper part of the body here, which needs to be darker, and making sure that these lighter streaks stand out, and also adding a little bit more value to these gills so that they would stand out. Overall, I didn't think that the drawing was super complex, and it went rather quickly, but the most complex part of it, in my opinion, was just trying to make the mixed media work for me as best as possible, because obviously the colored pencils are completely different from pastel pencils, and I'm just trying to use the advantages of both of them and the way they interact with this paper, because there's a little bit of texture here as a result of work with those colored pencils, but I didn't want to remove all of that texture. I like a little bit of that texture. It makes the main subject appear a little bit more complex, like maybe there are some unpredictable smaller details that I left there that will entertain the eye of the viewer and make the drawing appear more complex. So the bottom or the belly area of the shark is darker. It's mostly in the shadow because it's facing away from the light source, and I'm still adding a little bit more of those lighter effects those light streaks, as well as refining that area around the gills. So all I have left to do is a little bit more of this belly area, or the side of the body here, as well as the pectoral fins, those larger fins on the sides of the body. And the dorsal fin won't even be visible here. That's the one that sharks are most notorious for, I suppose. I'm just going to fill in the rest of this with this light dull greyish color, and refine some of the smaller details, like these speckled details which mark this transition between the upper darker part of the shark's body and the lower lighter part, or the belly area. And I'm just going to add a few more of these light effects here and there, just so that I would really suggest to the viewer that the scene takes place underwater, even though that's not that easy to do. It's easier said than done, I suppose. Just finishing the work on this pectoral fin here, making the edge to the left a little bit darker so that it would stand out against the belly area, even though that too is easier said than done, because I have to work in a combination of pastel and colored pencil, so blending it is not always as easy as you'd think. But I'm just gonna go over this darker area a little bit with a lighter color, and then add a few of those lighter streaks here as well with a light gray color. Like I said, that's a light warm gray. And then just do a little bit more refining on the background, and maybe add a few touches of that background color to the main subject. I put my signature in the lower left corner, and now the drawing is done. I hope you like it. Let me know what you think in the comments. Give me a like, subscribe, check out my other videos. And if you want to see more content and longer videos, check out my Patreon. Thanks for watching. I'm going to see you in the next one. Bye bye.